Hey, so it's 2021, new year, new you, and you want to ascend to the ranks of the Linux elite and be able to squeeze your new catchphrase, I use Arch by the way, into every conversation. Or maybe you just want a simple Linux setup to run your desktop, or your home automation server, or your streaming server, or whatever. Either that, or you've fallen deep into a YouTube rabbit hole and somehow ended up here. In which case, strap in. This is going to be great. Let's get to work. Now, a few things have changed since my last video on this topic, and I know that because the YouTube comments section has become increasingly angry, so we're going to rectify that today. Let's start as we always do. Head to archlinux.org and grab the latest install media. Okay, so on archlinux.org, what we're going to want to do is go to the Downloads button, or the Download button on the header, and navigate down to your country of residence to get a local mirror. I'm going to go here because I'm in Canada, and get the latest Arch ISO, and that's going to be this one here, the second from the top in my case. Okay, so this is downloaded. The next thing we need to do is write this bootable install ISO to a USB thumb drive so that we can take it to the target PC and boot from it. If you are doing this on a VM or via hypervisor, you can pretty much ignore this next step and just upload the ISO to your hypervisor as you usually would and add it as a boot device on the VM. So there's a couple ways you can write this ISO to a thumb drive. I prefer to use software called Etcher, and you can get Etcher by Googling the word Etcher. The link you want to click is the one here that says Belina Etcher, and you can download it by selecting your platform of choice and clicking that button. Or if you're already on Linux, you can download it from here, or you can probably use your package manager to grab it. So I have Etcher, so let's open that up. Once you're in Etcher, you want to go select the image from your most recent downloads. Then select your thumb drive. In my case, there's only one, so I'll say okay to that. And then just click the flash button and it will flash the ISO image to your thumb drive. Once the flash completes, it'll automatically unmount your drive, and now you're ready to take it over to your target machine. So I've created a VM and loaded the boot ISO as a CD-ROM device and booted from it. What you want to do now is make sure you select the top menu item here, Arch Linux Install Medium, UEFI, and then go ahead and boot that. Okay, so after the boot process completes, we're dropped into a live Linux environment, and this is how we're going to perform the installation right from here. So right now we're looking at a console output from my hypervisor of the VM where this Arch Linux install is booting from. To make things a little bit easier on the eyes, I don't have a whole lot of control over this console. I can't change text size or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the SSH server on this machine, and then I'm going to log into it from a nicer looking terminal. So this is an optional step. You guys might want to do this if you're using a headless server or a server that's in a a not convenient location, so that you can continue the install from your desktop. But this is, this isn't a necessary step for everybody. So okay. Grab the IP address from the server. In this case, it's 192.168.1.224, and I will attempt to log into that from my own terminal. Okay, so here's an important one. Obviously, to do this, we have to know the root password. I currently don't know the root password, so I'm just going to go in here and set it really quick. Okay, and here we are. We have a clean root console that's just, basically connected directly to the live environment. It looks exactly like the live environment, except we can now change text sizes to make this a little more easier to follow along. So in order to get started with the install, the first obvious step is we need to go straight to the Arch wiki and open up the install guide. The quickest way to get there is probably just do a Google search for Arch install guide. And then it'll be the first entry, the installation guide on the Arch wiki. And we'll start working our way through the installation guide. So we've already acquired the image. Verify signature, now that's something that's, might be good or best practice, but it's a little bit out of scope for this installation tutorial. This is a way that you can use MD5 signatures to make sure that the ISO you downloaded is succinct and exactly what you expect it to be. But 99 times out of 100, it's going to be fine unless something gets corrupted during the download. So this is something that you can look into on your own, but it's not expressly required usually, or especially not for this tutorial. So prepare an installation medium. We've done that. Boot the live environment. We've done that as well. Set the keyboard layout. So that's something that I didn't have to do this time around. The keyboard layout default is US, and I'm out of Canada, so my keyboard is the same as the US. But if you are using a international keyboard or a keyboard with special characters that needs to be defined, you would see how to do that in this area here. But obviously, that's not something I'm going to be able to demonstrate. Okay, so verify the boot mode. What this is going to do for us is it's going to tell us if our system is booted in EFI mode or in BIOS mode. Most modern hardware will boot in EFI, whereas if you're on a VM, it could be BIOS, could be EFI, depends on your settings. So I've set this VM up to boot in EFI, so that way we can go through kind of the slightly more complex setup of an EFI system. If you happen to be in MBR or BIOS mode, just follow those specific instructions when it comes to the bootloader, but I'll let you know when that is. In order to determine if you're booted in EFI or MBR mode, they provided this command here. So I'll copy this, switch over, and we'll paste that in there and run this. So it's an ls command, as you can see. It's just lsing on sys firmware EFI bars, and that'll be populated if you are booted in EFI mode, which I am. If you're not in EFI mode, if you're in MBR mode, it would say something like ls directory does not exist or something of that nature. But clearly we can see we are in EFI mode, so we'll continue like that. Okay, the next step is to update the system clock. So we'll just do a system or time date CTL status on the machine just to see that our system clock is correct. And according to this, it is 2339 UTC. Let's check that with Google. Do Google UTC time. 2339 is correct, so I have nothing more to do here. If your clock is incorrect, just set it according to the instructions, or set it up to use NTP, which will do the same. Okay, so the next step is partitioning the disks. This is the first thing that's going to be different if you are booting MBR or EFI. On an EFI system, you do have to make a boot partition that we'll go through. If you're doing with MBR, you just need to make a root partition. So you can see here the two different partitioning schemes. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what exactly all this means, but let's go through the partitioning setup now. So I'm going to have a look at the disk topology on my system right now using the lsblk command. And we can see here that I have one 100 gig disk, and I've got a couple of virtual kernel devices that are being created by the Arch ISO. But the physical SDA disk here is all that I've got. So I'm going to go to partition that using the CG disk tool. Okay, it's going to say it's a damaged disk or non-GPT disk. That's because it has no partition table. We'll say OK to that. And in this free space, we'll create a new partition, and that's going to be our boot partition. So it's recommended that these partitions are around 512 megabytes in size. So that's what I'll do. I'll create first sector, default, size, and sector. So I'm going to say 512M for 512 megabytes. The hex code is not going to be 8300. I think it's EF00, but let's hit L, capital L, to verify that. Okay, type search string or enter to show all code. So I'm going to type EFI because I know the partition type is EFI. Yes, EF00 is going to be my partition type. So enter to continue, EF00. Okay, partition name, we'll call this boot. A partition name really isn't required. It's just something that I'm going to use to better identify what these partitions are for later on. So we have our boot partition. Now we're going to go back to the free space. We're going to make another partition here. This one's going to be swap. So I want to make 1 gig of swap. I think this VM has like 4 gigs of RAM in it, so I'm going to have 1 gig of swap. But obviously that's going to be different based on what you want in your system. So I'll say 1 gig. I do not know the hex code for swap, so I'm going to hit L again, and I'm going to type swap. Okay, Linux swap looks like it's 8200, so I'll hit enter again. 8200 is going to be my partition type code. Partition name swap. Okay, and then we'll go back down to the free space. I'll make one more new. I'm going to use the full remaining space here, so I'll hit the default for first sector, the default for last sector. The hex code for this will be 8300, which we can see here is Linux file system, and that's exactly what we want. And the partition name, we'll call this Arch. Okay, so we have our 3 partitions here, boot, swap, and Arch. Arch being our root partition where the OS will be installed. We're going to go ahead and say write the partition table to the disk. It's going to give us a warning saying it might destroy data by doing this. Just type yes. And this partition was, and this operation was completed successfully. So we can now quit. Okay, now if we do lsblk, we can see the topology again. And we can see that we now have 3 partitions. We have our EFI partition, our swap, and our data partition where our root installation is going to be. If we go back to the install guide, we can see here that we've now created the partitions. The next step is to format them. So in order to format them, we're going to be using 3 different types of formatting. The first one will be our boot partition. It's going to get formatted F32, FAT32, I guess. And now you can find that information in this link here. So I'll open this link in a new tab, and we will scroll down to the formatting here of the boot partition, and it says, you can see here that we're going to make fs fat type FAT32 on our device. So we'll go back and we'll say make fs dot fat f32 just dev sda1. Okay, that's completed. We'll go back to our page here. We'll deal with the swap next, since that's SDA2, and we'll use the make swap command on the device SDA2. So there's our 1 gigabyte swap partition created. And the next thing we need to do is format our main root file system, and we're going to use ext4 as recommended here. So we'll snap back and say make fs.ext4/dev sda3. Okay, so now we have our 3 file systems. The topology should not have changed. Looks good. So now that we have our file systems created, we need to mount them so that we can begin to write the OS to them. We'll start by mounting our root partitions. Say mount /dev sda3, and we'll mount it at /mnt. We're also going to turn on our swap partition, so we're going to say swap on /dev /sda2. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to mount the boot partition. And the boot partition gets mounted in the root file system at /boot. So before we mount it, we're going to create that directory. We'll say make directory /p /mnt/boot. So remember, the root partition is mounted at /mnt, so we're going to make the boot partition at /mnt/boot. So now we'll mount the boot partition in the /mnt/boot folder we just created. So mount So all our file systems are mounted, and now we can carry on with the installation portion of the installs. So it gives us some instructions here to select which mirrors we want to use. I'm going to leave it at the default just for the tutorial. we're going to be using the tool packstrap. So we're going to be using packstrap, and we're going to direct it at /mnt, and then we're going to list the packages that we want to install with the OS. So it lists here to use base, Linux, and Linux firmware. I'm definitely going to choose those, but I'm also going to add some more. So we'll do a packstrap /mnt, and I'm going to, and I'll install the base, Linux firmware. I also want to install base devel, as well as some text editors like VI or Nano. And now would be the time, if you, especially if you're on a Wi-Fi device, if you want to install any additional network managers like WPA Supplicant or Network Manager itself. This base install will come with systemd networkd, so if you're comfortable there, that's fine, and that's what I'm going to use, at least at the beginning. So I will send this, and here we go, installing the packages straight to our root partition. Okay, so that's installed. We'll switch back to the wiki here. And just as a note, I know I mentioned installing additional packages just before the install there, but there's a whole section here of other packages you might want to consider adding, and some links to learn more about what you might need. So definitely check this out if you're not sure all the packages you might need, and again, especially if you're on Wi-Fi. So the next step is to generate an FStab, which stands for File System Table. And this is going to tell the OS at boot time where your drives are located and what the topology of your operating system is going to be. So let's look at what this command outputs before we commit it to a file, and just make sure that everything is as we would expect it to be. So you can see here the command is genfstab-u /mnt. And we'll take that back to our system and run this. And you can see in the FStab file we have SDA3 as our root, we have SDA1 as our boot, and SDA2 as our swab, and that's exactly what we expect. So we will take the full command, and we will create the FStab file in /mnt/etc/FStab, which is exactly where it needs to be. We'll send that command. And now for the very first time, we're actually going to enter into the system that we just installed and do some configuration from the inside. So we'll say arch/mnt, and now we were inside our new installation. Okay, so there's a number of steps that the install guide wants us to perform now, so we'll just kind of run through those. So the first one is setting your time zone, and we're going to set that by creating a symlink in etc local time. So we'll say ln-sf/usr Now all the time zones that are available are in USR share zone info, where obviously wherever you live it's going to be slightly different, but I'm going to say Canada. See what we have available to us. Canada Eastern, and that symlink will be created at /etc/. The next thing is we're going to generate some clock config settings by using this command, hwclock sys2hc. Okay, we're now going to generate our locale. So we're going to edit this file here. This is why it's important to have a text editor. vi etc locale.gen. For me, I'm going to use the enusutf8, so I'll uncomment this, but if your locale is one of these other ones, obviously just uncomment the line that's relevant to you. But for me, it's this one. I'll save this and run locale-gen. Okay. I'm also going to edit or create the locale.conf file and insert a line into it. So in this, I'm setting the lang variable equal to enusutf8. Again, there's an explanation on the Arch Wiki if you have a different language to set, this is where you would go check it and find out what your value should be. So I'll save this. The next step is a keyboard layout, but again, I don't need to change from the default. Okay, so that's kind of our localization settings set up. Now we're going to move into network settings. So I'm going to go and create a hostname file and set the hostname of the machine. And I'll call this host Arch, but obviously you can be, more creative than me and pick something better than that. Okay, so the next step that it wants us to perform is creating a new init RAM-FS. Now the installation guide says that this is usually not required because make init CPIO is probably run during the kernel installation of the packstrap, but it also does not hurt to do, and it's a step that I always perform, just in case. I want to have my best chance at having a clean boot the first time. So I'll go back and I'll run make init CPIO. And you might see some warnings or different messages throughout this process, but as long as the command completes successfully, you should be all right. Before we reboot, we definitely want to set a root password. So okay, so I have a root password set. And one last step before we reboot, we're going to install a bootloader. So this is documented quite well in the Arch install guides. So we'll go to the bootloader section, we'll click this link, open up a new tab, and now we get to pick a bootloader that we want to use. So again, depending on if you started with a UEFI install or an MBR install, there's going to be different bootloaders that work for your use case. I tend to always use Grub. Grub works in all cases, so on my MBR systems I use Grub, and my EFI systems I use Grub, and I haven't really had any problems with it. So I'll select Grub, and that'll take us to the Arch Wiki page for Grub to do a Grub install. This might look pretty intimidating. There's a lot of information in here for sure, but just try to make use of the table of contents. We're going to go to UEFI systems and installation, and this will give us the steps we need to complete to install Grub on our EFI system. So first it says install the packages Grub and EFI boot manager. So go back here, and now since we're in the installation, we're not going to use packstrap anymore. We're going to use pacman, which is the Arch package manager. And we'll say Grub and EFI boot MGR. Nope, it would help if I spelled it correctly. EFI boot manager. Okay, proceed with the installation, and now Grub and EFI boot MGR are installed. So now I'll grab this command here. This is the Grub install command, which we need to run in order to make the bootloader work properly. You'll see that the EFI directory here is set to ESP. Now, the Arch Wiki is just kind of using this interchangeably because people's boot partitions aren't always at /boot. Your ESP or your EFI boot partition might be called something else, /EFI, or what have you. So they've just used the words ESP to signify that. So we're going to, when we copy this command, we're going to replace that with the location of our /boot directory. So again, I'll paste this in, and I'm going to go back to where EFI directory equals ESP, and I'll say it's in /boot. Okay, we'll run this command. Okay, installation finished, no error reported. That's good. Again, there's kind of an explanation here of what we just discussed about replacing the ESP here. If you're unsure, or if you've chosen to put your if you've chosen to put your EFI boot directory at a different place, you can use this information to figure out what needs to be in that spot. But if you're following along, it'll just be /boot. The last thing we need to do is create a Grub configuration. Okay, so I'm moving on to the configuration of Grub. It says here on an installed system, Grub loads the /boot/grub/grub.cfg configuration file. We don't have that yet. We just installed Grub. We don't have any configs made for it. So we're going to use this command down here to generate our Grub config for us. So it says grub make config -o /boot grub config. Again, if your EFI directory is not at /boot, this is something you might need to change. But for us, this command will work just fine. Okay, we can see in here it did find our Linux image, it found our initRD. Okay, so everything looks good from a bootloader perspective. We're now at the point where we can attempt to reboot the system and see if we've made any mistakes or if something was done wrong. This is kind of the first litmus test we get to have of our installation. So first we'll exit the chroot, and bounce back into the Arch ISO. And just because we're rebooting the system this time, I'm going to go back to the terminal, like the direct VM terminal, and run the reboot, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to use shutdown-r now to reboot the system. Okay, so we see the Grub bootloader screen, which is a great sign. We'll hit enter on Arch Linux. So perfect, we booted into our system. We can see that we are now on Arch. We're not on the live installation media anymore. This is the actual OS that we just installed. So we'll log in with root and the password that we just gave it. And we are now completely logged in. If you made it this far, I can honestly say the worst is definitely behind you. There's only a couple more steps that we need to complete. I'll have a fully functioning Linux system to customize as needed. So you might notice that we do not have a network connection at the moment. This is obviously something that we need to fix. So if you installed a different network manager during the installation phase, now would be the time to look at the Arch Wiki page and configure that. For me, however, I went with the default, which is going to be systemd networkd. So I will switch over to the Arch Wiki page for that. So the first thing it wants us to do is start and enable the systemd networkd service and the systemd resolved service. So I'll say systemctl start systemd networkd and systemctl start resolved. Now at this point we need to see which network devices systemd networkd recognizes. So we'll use the command networkctl list. So we can see here we have a Ethernet device called ENS18. This might seem a little bit cumbersome, but for systemd networkd, we actually need to create a network file that defines how we want to use our network device. There's other network managers that are a little more straightforward and automatic, but today I'm kind of going through the most basic setup of Arch Linux, which is using the base packages of systemd networkd and systemd resolved. So in the Arch Wiki page for systemd networkd, we can see that there's two entries for what a config file might look like for a wired adapter. So wired adapter using DHCP and wired adapter using a static IP. So I'm going to go ahead and use the wired adapter using DHCP entry, and I'm going to create my configuration file at etc systemd network and call it 20-wired.network. So I'll use Nano to create the configuration file. So Nano, let's see, network, we'll call it 20, just like the Arch Wiki suggests, and we'll set up our file here. So we know that we have a device called ENS18, so in the match box I'll put name equals ENS18. Make sure you watch your capitalization on these. It's very case sensitive, so if you have not a capital N under name or a different capitalization in your device name, it will not work. And we'll say under the network heading, we'll say DHCP equals yes. Okay, Control X to exit, and we will write the buffer. Say yes to that, and here we are now. So if I go ahead and restart systemd networkd, we should have a network connection. So that service is restarted. I'll also restart systemd resolved. Okay, so it just took a while for my DHCP. I can see that I have an IP address and the network is connected. So now that I have a network connection, I'm going to go ahead and set up a user account that I can use instead of root. So I'll say user add -G for its primary group is going to be users, -big G for its secondary groups. I'll join the group wheel, storage, and power. I'll do -M to create a home directory, and I'll set my username as Brad. Okay, I'll set a password for my user account. Another thing I'm going to want to do is add my user to the Pseudoers file so that I can perform root commands when necessary without having to be root. And I'll do that by typing vi sudo. And in here, we want to allow the wheel group to do things. I prefer to use no password, but it depends on your security taste. You can uncomment this line if you'd like it to prompt you for a password each time, but I want to be able to sudo without a password, so I'll uncomment that and write and quit. So now I have a user set up for myself that's not root, but still has the privileges to use the sudo command when needed. One thing you'll definitely want to do now that the network is set up is enable systemd networkd and enable systemd resolved to start at boot. So we'll do that by saying systemctl enable systemd networkd and systemctl enable systemd resolved. Okay. One last thing I'm going to do before we sign off here is I'm going to install the SSH daemon so that I can once again connect to this machine remotely and perform administration tasks without having to be on the physical console like we are now. So I'll say pacman sy open.ssh. So this will install the open.ssh package. And then I'll say systemctl start sshd and systemctl enable sshd. So double check the IP address. It's now 192.168.1.213. So I'll attempt to connect to that with my new user. Okay, so here we are logged into our new Arch system remotely with our new user. I guess at this point it's safe to call this installation complete. If there's anything that you'd like to have more clarity on, or maybe something I didn't explain well enough, feel free to ask in the comments. And if you like this kind of content, please leave a thumbs up. And if you don't like it, leave a thumbs down. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.